What's going on, everyone? It's Ben from YGO from Zero, back with another Critter format video. And this one's going to be a bit shorter than normal, but I just wanted to talk about the latest Critter format tournament, the Creepy Critter Extravaganza, and which decks did well, which decks joined, and what I think it means for the meta as a whole. But before I dive into all of this, if you like seeing this sort of content about old retro Yu-Gi-Oh formats, then please consider subscribing to my channel. We're almost at 250 subscribers, and it would be really cool if we reach that milestone by the end of November. But now that that's out of the way, let's talk about this event. So this was a really fun event put on by Format Library. Thanks to the people there for throwing it. And it actually had a fair amount of people join for a Critter format tournament. We had 40 people in the event, which is more than honestly I expected, as the format isn't the most popular out there. But it was great to see. Now, as for the decks those people brought, it was mainly taken up by Mask Control. About half the players were playing Mask Control. And if you'll see on the right here in the deck category representation, about 3/4 of the players were playing some sort of control deck, which makes sense as control is one of the most common strategies in the format, and especially Mask Control is one of the best decks in the format, so it makes sense that it's very well represented. And indeed, 5 of the 8 top players were on a Mask Control sort of build, with some slight differences between them, but this shows that Mask Control still is one of the most dominant decks in the format, and is still the major thing that you have to watch out for. But it wasn't the only deck that did well in the tournament. 5 players entered with Exodia, and Exodia was the winner of the last tournament, so, people came to this one relatively prepared for it, or at least I saw some main deck text for it. And even despite this, there were 2 players in the top 8 that did actually make it with Exodia. I was one of those players, and you can watch my games in the last video that I released. The last remaining deck in the top cut was actually a deck known as Goblin Control, so sort of hand control-ish deck, which we'll get to later when I discuss each of the top 8 decks in more detail. But just going through some of the other decks that people brought, we see that people brought Flip Control, Muka Muka Turbo, Clown Control, Cannon Burn, Harpy, Stall Burn, and Vanilla Beatdown. So there was a relatively wide variety among the different decks here. One thing that I was a little bit surprised by is that there weren't many people on a sort of aggressive beatdown strategy. Only really Vanilla Beatdown and Cannon Burn can really qualify that, and potentially Harpy, depending on how they're playing it. I guess Muka Muka Turbo could also count as being an aggressive strategy, as it's a deck that sort of just relies on having a lot of cards in your hand to make sure that Muka Muka is pretty big. But I'd still say that that is more of a control-ish sort of strategy, because you want to play cards to bring your hand up to that point in the first place. And you likely aren't playing things like Jirai Gumo or any of the other really big beaters like that. So I was kind of surprised. I thought it would be more highly represented, and I think it is a very good deck. And I think maybe in the future it can definitely climb its way back into Top Cut if people experiment with it more. But as is, so few people brought it that it makes sense that it didn't make it into the top 8. Speaking of the top 8, let's just talk about those top 8 decks. So starting at the 5th place decks, we of course have the 2 Exodia decks, which was one by me and then one by Return Winner. And it looks like our main decks are the same, both based on Paolo and S's winning build from the last tournament. I can't speak to Return Winner, but I played this version of the deck to sort of see what people were playing to counter Exodia strategies, and I did see some pretty powerful main deck Exodia hate. However, despite this, the deck was still able to take names. It won me enough games to get me into top 8. And so I think the deck is still very strong, even if people are expecting it. This tournament was sort of the big test of, did Exodia do well last tournament just because it was a complete surprise for most people? Or is it actually a major threat in the tournament, even when people are looking out for it? And I think it definitely proved that it is the latter here. The other 5th place decks were both Mask Control lists. They look pretty standard, so I'm not going to go into major depth about them. If you want more information about them, you can check out my previous Mask Control videos. But a very not standard deck that made it to the top 8 is Free the Manatee's 3rd place Goblin Control deck list. Now this is a really interesting one. It's called Goblin Control because it is playing the Robin Goblin and a Wall of Illusion, which can be a devastating combo if you pull it off. But it's really interesting because this deck is doing a lot of strange things. It's playing a lot of one-ofs. A one-of Maneater Bug, one of Mask of Darkness, one of Mask Sorcerer even, one of Muka Muka, one of White Magical Hat. It's playing a lot of these one-ofs, and I think that makes some sense as Sangan and Witch can easily search those one-ofs. And clearly that strategy paid off pretty well for them here. It's also playing a Summoned Skull, maybe to pair with the Change of Heart, but it can also just be a good beater to bring out if you can afford to tribute it. So I think that's a pretty neat inclusion. And it's also playing 2 Dark Elves. I don't really personally like Dark Elf. I like Jiraigumo a lot better, but Dark Elf seemed to have worked out for them here. One last interesting thing to note here before moving on to the other top decks is that they're playing no counter traps. This is really interesting in a control strategy, as a lot of counter traps like Solemn Judgment are so huge in this format, especially among a lot of masked control lists. So I think it's a really bold choice that they're not doing it, but it clearly worked out for them. I'll be curious to see if more people adopt this sort of playstyle in the future, or if they lean more heavily towards the standard sort of counter trap and mass control builds. Speaking of those standard counter trap and mass control builds, let's move on to the other top decks here. And I said moving on to the standard builds, but these builds are really not standard, except for maybe Lucas Gustafsson's build, which was the second place build. Now, when I say it's a standard build, I don't mean that's a bad thing. I think it's actually a very good thing, because this standard build is a very good build. It clearly saw Lucas a lot of success here, making it all the way to second place. But I really like some things that the other top 3 mass control lists are doing here. Let's start with Jazz's list. One thing that you'll notice right off the bat is that Jazz is playing a Jiraigumo in the main deck. I think that is a really cool inclusion. Jiraigumo can be searched off of Witch of the Black Forest, and having just a surefire 2200 attacker can be really big. So I like that inclusion a lot. They've also cut down on their number of trap holes down to 2, presumably to make space for some of the other cards that they're playing. And I also think this is a pretty heads-up play. Trap hole is easily the weakest of the trap lineup that most decks play. And by cutting one, you play less into things like Last Will, which a lot of decks are playing. So I think that, Jazz saw that it was one of the weakest links of the deck, so they just cut it out to fit in a lot more good stuff here. So this is a really neat version of the deck, and I hope that more people experiment with the Jiraigumo in mass control in the future, as I think that Jazz's tournament success here does show that it has a place. But this version of the deck was not what won. The version of the deck that won was Aratos' first place mass control list. And this deck is doing some very interesting things as well that I really do want to talk about. There are 2 major things I want to highlight. The first is the main deck card destruction. I think this is a really heads-up move preparing for the Exodia matchup. And it can also have a lot of uses outside of that. This is a format where things like Witch and Sangan can search out powerful cards from the deck very easily, and things like Magician of Faith or Mask of Darkness can get back spells and traps that can be really devastating if you let your opponent keep them. So having a card destruction to potentially activate after the battle phase when your opponent's added these things off of their searchers or flip monsters can be very, very powerful, even if your opponent isn't on Exodia. The other major thing that I want to talk about here is the 7 Tools of the Bandit. I think this is a really cool inclusion in the deck. Of course, it stops powerful traps like Mirror Force, or potentially even a Waboku if you're trying to push for game. But the really cool thing about a Mirror Force is the way it interacts in the control mirrors. If you get into a Solemn Judgment war where you activate a card and your opponent activates Solemn Judgment, and you want to counter that Solemn Judgment, you can activate 7 Tools of the Bandit and pay a lot less than your opponent is going to, which can be really devastating. Given that these sorts of Solemn wards do happen a fair amount of the time in this mirror match, I think that having the 7 tools is basically essentially like playing a 4th copy of Solemn Judgment in a way. It's obviously not equivalent, as Solemn Judgment can stop a lot of very powerful spells that your opponent may have. But I think in the control mirror especially, it can serve that purpose. And that's really, really cool. So I'm curious to see if more people will adopt this tech going forward. Besides that, the deck does look pretty standard. They are playing 2 Giant Soldier of Stone, which isn't always the way these decks go, but I like it. Having defensive options can be very good if your opponent doesn't have a way to out them. And so I like that in this deck. But everything else is pretty standard, which does show how robust this Masked Sorcerer core really is. Mask Control is sort of the standard deck of the format. It's the deck that's very emblematic of the format that a lot of people like to play. And this tournament proves that despite not winning the last tournament, Mask Control is still very much king of Critter format. But what did you all think of this tournament and the results of this tournament? Do you think that there were certain decks that were underrepresented, or certain techs that you really liked that you didn't think of before seeing these top deck lists? Also, let me know how you think the meta will evolve from here. Do you think that Exodia will change up its strategy to potentially counter these Mask Control decks more? Or do you think that Mask Control will add even more techs? Let me know down in the comments below. And until next time, I've been Ben from YGO from Zero, and I'm signing off.